Grüß, willkommen in einem Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 56 of my figure gaming video series. In this video, I wish to conduct an analysis of the economics of different metal figure scales, specifically for ancients and Napoleonics, American Civil War and everything in between. What scale should a new player with minimal cash initially consider, basically? To keep this analysis scope, or the analysis scope, into something which can be used to provide a useful answer, I'm focusing on metal figures only, specifically 6mm, 10mm, 15/18mm and 25mm. Plastic figures and printed figures are a valid choice, but doing the economics of those type of figures is difficult, and I'm just going to bypass it or ignore it for this video. While this could apply to World War I, World War II, Cold War, etc., my main focus is ancients, Napoleonics, American Civil War, and everything in between. The other assumption I'll be making is the number of figures per base will be the same. That is, 4 infantry figures per close order base, 2 per open order base, 2 cavalry figures for a light horse base, and 3 cavalry figures for other horse base. For Napoleonics, I'll also use the US basing system as well. For 6mm figures, the number of infantry figures may vary based on the number of figures on a strip. For Heroic and Ross, you may use 5 infantry figures per base because those figures come in strips of 5. On the other hand, other brands provide the figures in strips of 4. I'll cover the optimal base size after we conduct the actual figure price comparison. Looking at 6mm figures, I'm going to look at 2 brands, Heroic and Ross and Bacchus. I am not looking at shipping costs, as these can vary dramatically, but I tend to find Heroic and Ross has cheaper shipping costs than Bacchus. But the difference is minor, and it could be due to where I live. When ordering anything on the internet, always do a spot check of shipping costs. That can influence what brand you may prefer to purchase. While Heroic and Ross does have some benefits, which I do really like, I'll use Bacchus mainly in my analysis. A quick note, all prices are ex-VAT. While there are a surprisingly large number of 10mm providers, I have only ever purchased 10mm figures for Pendraken, so I'll be using those figures in my analysis. As for 15/18mm figures, there is a plethora of suppliers, and I'll be mainly looking at just 2. A quick note, there is a big difference in shipping costs between the 2 brands that I'm showing here, Lancashire and Miniature Figures. Lancashire is more expensive in terms of shipping. However, even when we factor in the difference in shipping, Lancashire is still cheaper. On the other hand, I find Miniature Figures to be generally better figures on average. There are exceptions, of course. One downside is that they are 18mm figures, not 15mm figures, so you need to be careful what figures you order for specific base sizes. Because of the large difference, I'm probably going to include both ranges in my comparison. I am personally not a 25mm collector, so my only exposure to 25mm is miniature figurines. I don't know how they compare with other ranges, but I have to assume they're probably average and their pricing is probably in the center somewhere. This shows the results of my initial analysis. As you can see, there are large differences in pricing, with 6mm being very cheap indeed. This is based on a typical Napoleonic force mix, 48 infantry elements and 12 cavalry elements. Obviously, you will need artillery as well, but I'm attempting to make this as simple as possible and also make it applicable to ancients as well. So if you're going to go down the Napoleonic's path, you need to add artillery to this. In my analysis, I am assuming 3 cavalry figures per base. I tend to use 2 cavalry per base for Napoleonic's 15mm, but do use 3 per base for non-light horse for ancients. And I also use 3 per base for 6mm and also for 10mm. So to make this as simple as possible, I'm only going to be looking at 3 cavalry figures per base in my pricing analysis. If this was the only factor involved, pricing, it would be a simple choice to make, 6mm. However, there are a number of physical factors to consider when going down a specific path, which is base size and how practical those base sizes are. The final factor, which can be actually more important for players, is bling, and I'll be dealing with that at the end. If using 6mm figures, you could use base widths of 2 centimeters. The figures will fit. However, I've done this in the past and the bases are so fiddly to use, I decided this was simply not practical. After a reasonable amount of experimentation, I have come to the conclusion the optimal minimum width is 3 centimeters. In terms of depth, infantry are 1 centimeters and cavalry is 1.5 centimeters. These sizes are very usable. However, I tend to also use movement trays to make it easy to move these figures around. The most common rules I use encourage movement tray in their use, so this is good for me, but it may not be good for rules such as DBMM. This shows an example of the movement trays I use. However, they only suit specific rules. If you're going to use these base sizes for an element maneuver set of rules, such as DBMM or DBM or ADLG, you'll find this element size is very fiddly indeed. It could work, but I personally feel it's not going to be viable. So, in summary, 6mm may not be a viable scale of figures to do or use when we consider this exercise or the restrictions of this exercise, unless your rules really suit movement trays or they are not element maneuver set of rules where the exact element position is always critical. However, it should be noted 6mm figures is not knocked out. You can adopt the basing style that is recommended in the DBMM rules, where each infantry base is 4 centimeters wide and consists of 16 infantry figures. This also mitigates the biggest issue with 6mm, its fiddliness. 6mm bases are always going to be fiddly to pick up and move. Using thicker bases does resolve a lot of these issues, but those issues still exist. Using 4 centimeter wide bases assists this greatly, that is in terms of reducing the issue. While never as good as 15mm or 10mm, it's acceptable, and the benefits of 6mm figures come to the fore, which is the mass effect of them. The only issue is if you're already using or already have a 15mm force mix using 4 centimeter wide bases, there is little benefit in moving to 6mm except, purely for cost reasons. If we adopt our 4 centimeter wide bases with 6mm, its cost per army is still significantly lower than that of 15mm, but much higher than my original analysis. So it is worthwhile doing. On the other hand, it's slightly more expensive than 10mm. So if cheapness was your main objective, I feel you could also seriously consider 10mm figures. Let's now look at 10mm figures. With 10mm figures, the story is very different from 6mm. The optimal base width is 3 centimeters from the get-go, which is the base width of almost all Napoleonic and ancient rules prior to 1990. This would bring you back to the old 15mm base size common before 15mm figures turned into 18mm figures. If we look at US basing, I would go with the standard basing for 15mm figures as well, which is 2 centimeters wide, 3 centimeters deep for infantry, and a 3 centimeter square for mounted or cavalry. 10mm is a viable scale, and in many ways brings me back to my old 15mm gaming back in the 1970s and 80s. From a cost point of view, it's half the cost of 15mm figures, so really represents a sweet spot for new gamers that don't have much cash. There is one minor issue with this basing, at least for myself. I use rules which use movement trays for ancients, and ideally I would like my cavalry to use 1.5 centimeter deep bases. The 10mm mounted figures have a total width or depth of 2 centimeters from tip of nose to end of tail. This is not an issue for anyone else, as few people use rules which use movement trays, so it's only a problem for myself. For everyone else, there is no issue with 10mm, and this is a very viable path for pretty much any other set of rules out there in the market. My solution, in my case, to overcome the issue that I mentioned was to consider the use of square bases, or even the US basing system. With those rules, and it bypasses the whole movement tray issue if I go down this path, and this works reasonably well. But anyway, that's my problem, not your problem. Let's now look at 15/18mm figures. If you're fielding actual real 15mm figures, you could go back to the old 3 centimeter wide bases. However, I don't think you can actually buy a lot of those old brands like first generation minifig or heritage, etc. However, even in the day, the figures were very crowded. So even if you could find real 15mm figures, ramming them on this base side is a little bit crowded. So I actually really like the current convention of using 4cm wide bases. If we look at US basing, and just a quick note, I convert US basing into metric. Obviously with US basing, we're dealing with a very different size. Instead of 3 centimeters, it's 1 inch. Instead of 2 centimeters, it's 3/4 of an inch. The 2 centimeters is very close to 3/4 of an inch. The 3 centimeters is a bit bigger, so just take that into note. Anyway, when we look at the US basing system, which was designed with the old 15mm figures, which were real 15mm figures, you may find the infantry rather crowded. However, if you're careful with what type of figures you buy, you can get them to fit on this base. For Napoleonics, you need to avoid any infantry figures firing a musket, for example. 15mm based armies are the most numerous, and they're a good overall figure scale. Good detail, easy to pick up, and you can still get the mass effect, and the playing area can still remain a reasonable size for a game. When 15mm first gained in popularity, it was mainly because gamers did not want to spend the cash required to field a 25mm force mix. 25mm figures were the first most common scale to be used back in the 1970s-80s, before 15mm became popular. And while the figure size has grown, the base sizes used back then can easily accommodate the new, bigger figures with ease. When painting up this scale, it looks fantastic. And for those interested in modelling, this scale, and perhaps 54mm as well, is the scale that they would gravitate to. The rise of skirmish rules has allowed this scale to also additionally flourish, basically because of the low number of figures required. It makes it actually affordable. But for the mainstream gamers, these figures are very expensive if you want to fit out a full DBMM army. Let's just go over all the options. The cheapest option is 6mm figures using standard figure density. However, this only suits specific rules such as board game conversions into figure gaming rules, which require movement trays to simulate stacking. For other rules, the figures are just too fiddly to use. If we move to 6mm figures using the recommended high density of figures, most of the fiddly issues go away. You also gain a nice mass effect, and the cost is still very reasonable, being about half the cost of 15mm figures. This is a good choice for gamers who wish to use their force mix with DBMM or DBA or ADLG or a traditional figure gaming set of rules. 10mm seems to be the winner if you're staying with standard figure densities on a base. This has returned to the old days of 15mm figures that were common back in the 1970s and 80s, and the figures are not fiddly, especially if you use thick bases. The detail is not as good as 15mm, but a lot better than 6mm. It should be noted, old 15mm, first generation minifig, didn't have particularly great detail. The newer 15/18mm figures are a lot better than the old. So to a large extent, you're going back to the old days. Many rules suggest you base them using a higher density of figures, which is viable as well, but quite frankly, if you're going to go down that path, I'd probably go down the 6mm path. 15mm figures, or armies, or force mixes is the default. At 125 quid per force mix, once you include the cost of shipping, bases and paint, you will not have much change from 200 quid. If you're getting to the hobby, this is what you need to expect if you wish to get or play DBM, DBMM, or ADLG. DBA is a lot cheaper as you need a lot less figures, and actually even ADLG in some cases need a lot less figures. But eventually you'll want to try something bigger, so you should probably initially look at getting a proper full-size force mix. However, while there are 15mm figures out there from Lancashire, etc., 18mm figures are likely which is likely the scale most players will gravitate to, as most 18mm figures are much more detailed and, quite frankly, look a lot better. I tend to prefer these figures for ancient and go for the cheaper figures for Napoleonic, but it all depends how much detail you want in your force mix. This force mix will easily exceed 200 quid. I personally am not a 25mm gamer, so when I actually did a price check on 25mm figures, I was a bit shocked. These are expensive figures, and I expect completing your force mix would set you back at least 600 quid. However, if you like bling, this is the path you will follow, as such a force mix would look fantastic on the playing area. If you went down the DBA path, the cost would dramatically reduce. I'm also seeing the attraction for plastic. I'm really seeing the attraction for plastic 1/72 scale figures. They are a lot cheaper and often have very, very good detail. The only issue is a constrained figure range. You need to buy whole packets of figures rather than basically purchase individual figures that you can tailor-make in any particular way you so desire. And so this concludes episode 56 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos, in this case looking at the economics of different figure scales when you want to build up your force mix. Alle guten Dingen, kommen zu einem Ende.